The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of their modest living room, casting soft golden streaks across the carpet. Malcolm sat cross-legged on the floor, a worn sketchbook in his lap and a stubby pencil in hand. He wasn't drawing his usual superheroes or rockets today, though. Instead, the page was covered with scattered words, scribbles that didn't quite make sense. His brown eyes, usually full of excitement, now stared blankly at the paper, lost in thought. Something wasn't right. It hadn't been for weeks now. At 9 years old, Malcolm was smarter than most kids his age. His teachers at school called him sharp as a tack, and his mom, Leah, always said he had a way of noticing things other people didn't. He could pick up on the tiniest details: a shift in tone, a sudden silence, the way someone's eyes darted away when they didn't want to tell the truth. And lately, he had been noticing a lot. The biggest thing was his dad. Darius had always been larger than life to Malcolm. A tall man with a booming laugh, Darius had a way of making even the most ordinary days feel special. He'd take Malcolm to the park, pushing him higher and higher on the swings until he felt like he could touch the sky. They'd sit on the hood of their car at night, pointing out constellations, with Darius making up funny stories about the stars. He was the kind of dad who made Malcolm feel invincible, like nothing in the world could hurt him as long as they were together. But Darius was gone now. At first, Leah told Malcolm his dad had to go away for a while. She didn't say where, but she promised it wasn't forever. "He loves you, Malcolm," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And he'd be here if he could." But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and Darius didn't come back. No phone calls, no letters. Just silence. Malcolm tried to ask questions. "Where is he, Mom? Did he leave because of me?" His voice would crack, his big brown eyes pleading for answers. Leah would always shake her head and tell him no. "It's not your fault, baby," she'd say softly. But her lips would press together after that, as if holding back words she couldn't bring herself to say. Still, Malcolm noticed things. The way Leah would tense up every time he mentioned his dad. How she'd change the subject or suddenly find something else to do. He noticed how she avoided looking at their family photos now, especially the one of all three of them at the beach, Darius's arm slung around her shoulders. And he noticed how she always locked the doors at night, double-checking them with a look in her eyes that wasn't there before. But what really puzzled Malcolm was how his mom reacted every time a police car drove by. It didn't matter if they were walking to the store or sitting in traffic. As soon as those blue and red lights flashed in the distance, Leah's whole body seemed to stiffen. Her hands would grip the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white, and her breathing would change short and fast, like she'd just run a race. Once, Malcolm even saw her pull into a gas station, pretending to check the tires, just to avoid driving past a parked police car. "Why do you do that, Mom?" Malcolm had asked her once. "Do what?" she replied, not meeting his eyes. "You get scared when you see the police." Leah paused for a moment, her hands busy folding laundry. "I'm not scared," she said, too quickly. "I just don't like being around them, that's all." "Why not?" "They're not always fair, Malcolm. Sometimes they make mistakes." It wasn't the answer Malcolm wanted, but he knew better than to press her. Still, the question lingered in his mind, growing bigger with each passing day. One day, Malcolm overheard something. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop really, he wasn't. But the walls in their small house were thin, and his mom didn't realize how loudly she was speaking on the phone. "I don't know what to tell him anymore, Renee," Leah whispered, her voice shaking. "He keeps asking about Darius. How do I explain this to a 9-year-old? Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. He crawled closer to the door, pressing his ear against the cool wood. "I can't tell him the truth, not yet," Leah continued. "He's just a kid. He doesn't need to know what happened. I'm trying to protect him. There was a long pause, and Malcolm's chest felt tight. What truth was his mom talking about? What didn't she want him to know? Daniels was the one who did it, Leah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He was the officer who arrested Darius. He's the reason my son doesn't have a father right now. Malcolm's blood ran cold. Daniels. Officer Daniels. He didn't know much about Officer Daniels, except that he was one of the cops who patrolled their neighborhood. Malcolm had seen him a few times, sitting in his squad car at the corner store or talking to other officers near the park. He was a tall man with a thick mustache and sharp eyes that always seemed to be watching. Malcolm didn't know what Officer Daniels had done to his dad, but he knew one thing for sure: Daniels had the answers he'd been looking for. The next morning, Malcolm sat quietly at the kitchen table, stirring his cereal but not eating it. His mom sat across from him, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. "Mom," Malcolm said suddenly, breaking the silence. Leah didn't look up. Did Officer Daniels take Dad away? The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Leah froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Slowly, she set it down, her eyes meeting Malcolm's. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Malcolm shrugged, trying to seem casual. "I just heard people talking." Leah sighed, rubbing her temples. "Malcolm, listen to me. You don't need to worry about Officer Daniels or anything he did. It's grown-up stuff, okay? Let me handle it." "But I want to know what happened," Malcolm insisted. His voice was firm, stronger than Leah had ever heard it. "I have a right to know." Leah's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked like she might tell him the truth. But then she shook her head, standing up and grabbing her purse. "Not now, Malcolm," she said. "We'll talk about it later." But Malcolm knew they wouldn't. Later that day, Malcolm stood at the corner of their street, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd seen Officer Daniels parked there a few times before, and today was no different. The squad car sat idling near the curb, its engine humming softly. Malcolm clenched his fists, his mind racing. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he had to confront Daniels. He had to know the truth. As he approached the car, Daniels noticed him and rolled down the window. "Hey there, kid," he said, his tone friendly but cautious. "What's up?" Malcolm's voice shook as he spoke, but his words were clear. "You're the one who took my dad away, aren't you?" Daniels's smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise and something else Malcolm couldn't quite place. "Guilt, maybe." "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniels said, his voice careful. "Yes, you do," Malcolm shot back, his eyes blazing. "You're the reason he's gone. I just want to know why." For a moment, Daniels didn't say anything. He just stared at Malcolm, his jaw tightening. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Kid," he said quietly, "it's not that simple." But to Malcolm, it felt very simple. Daniels knew the truth, and Malcolm wasn't going to stop until he got it. Malcolm's heart raced as he stared at Officer Daniels, who suddenly looked uncomfortable, almost as if he were trying to shrink into his uniform. The officer's face, which had always seemed stern and impenetrable, now showed cracks, hesitation, maybe even regret. But Malcolm didn't flinch. "Why won't you tell me?" Malcolm pressed. "I'm not a little kid. I can handle it." Daniels sighed, leaning back in his seat. "It's complicated, kid. Sometimes things happen, things we can't change." "That's not an answer," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "You don't think I deserve to know what happened to my dad? You're the one who took him away." "My mom said so." At the mention of Leah, Daniels visibly stiffened. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. For a long moment, the only sounds were the low hum of the squad car's engine and the distant chirping of birds. Finally, Daniels broke the silence. "Your dad was, in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all I can say. That's not good enough." Malcolm's voice cracked with frustration, tears stinging his eyes. He wiped them away angrily, refusing to cry in front of the man who had taken so much from him. "You ruined my family, and all you can say is wrong place, wrong time? That's not fair." Daniels looked away, his jaw clenched. "Life isn't always fair, kid. Then make it fair." Malcolm shot back. "Tell me the truth. What did he do? Why did you arrest him? What did he ever do to you?" Daniels flinched at the boy's words. For a split second, his carefully controlled expression slipped, and Malcolm caught a glimpse of something raw: pain, guilt, maybe even shame. "Look," Daniels said quietly, "I can't talk about this here. It's not the time or the place." "Then when?" Malcolm demanded. Daniels didn't answer. He reached for the ignition, turning the key to start the car. "Go home, kid," he said, his tone soft but final. "Talk to your mom." But Malcolm wasn't done. He stepped back as the squad car pulled away, the sound of its tires crunching against the gravel echoing in his ears. That night, Malcolm sat in his room, staring at the ceiling. The encounter with Daniels replayed in his mind like a broken record, each word etching itself deeper into his thoughts. Wrong place, wrong time. What did that even mean? His dad wasn't the kind of man to be in the wrong place. He was careful, responsible. He loved his family more than anything. So why would Daniels say that? The more Malcolm thought about it, the angrier he became. Why wouldn't anyone just tell him the truth? His mom, the officer, both of them acted like he couldn't handle it, like he was too young to understand. But he did understand. Something bad had happened to his dad, and the people who were supposed to protect him had taken him away. Malcolm clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. If no one else was going to tell him the truth, he'd find it himself. The next day, Malcolm decided to take matters into his own hands. He started by asking questions carefully, quietly, so his mom wouldn't catch on. "Hey, Mr. Jenkins," Malcolm said, stopping by the corner store on his way home from school. Mr. Jenkins was an older man who always seemed to know everything about everyone in the neighborhood. "Well, hey there, Malcolm," Mr. Jenkins said with a smile. "What can I do for you today? Do you remember my dad?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice casual. Mr. Jenkins's smile faltered just slightly. "Of course I do, son. Darius was a good man. Why do you ask?" I was wondering if you know why he's not around anymore," Malcolm said. "Like, did something happen?" Mr. Jenkins hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "Well, I don't know all the details, but I heard there was some kind of incident." "With the police? What kind of incident?" Malcolm pressed. "Hard to say," Mr. Jenkins said, his tone careful. "I just know it wasn't fair. Your dad got caught up in something he didn't deserve. That's all I'll say." Malcolm thanked him and left, his mind racing. It wasn't much, but it was confirmation. His dad hadn't done anything wrong, at least not anything serious. Over the next few days, Malcolm pieced together bits and pieces of information from overheard conversations, whispered gossip, and the occasional slip of the tongue. He learned that his dad had been stopped by the police one night while driving home from work. There had been some kind of misunderstanding, an accusation, maybe a struggle. The details were fuzzy, but one thing was clear: Officer Daniels had been involved. Malcolm's anger grew with each new detail. His dad hadn't been a criminal. He hadn't hurt anyone. So why was he gone? One afternoon, Malcolm came home to find his mom sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She looked up when she heard him come in, her eyes red and puffy. "Malcolm," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." "About Dad?" Malcolm asked, his heart pounding. Leah nodded, gesturing for him to sit down. "I've been trying to protect you," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But I think it's time you knew the truth." Malcolm sat down, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He was finally going to get the answers he'd been searching for. Leah took a deep breath. "Your dad was driving home from work one night when he got pulled over. The police said his car matched the description of a vehicle involved in a robbery. But it wasn't true. He hadn't done anything wrong. So why did they arrest him?" Malcolm asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was a misunderstanding," Leah said, choosing her words carefully. "Your dad tried to explain, but things got out of hand. Officer Daniels was there, and he made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" Malcolm asked, his anger bubbling to the surface. "They thought your dad was resisting arrest," Leah said, tears streaming down her face. "But he wasn't. He was scared, Malcolm. Scared they wouldn't believe him." Malcolm's heart ached as he listened to his mom's words. He could picture it in his mind, his dad, alone and afraid, trying to explain himself to a group of officers who wouldn't listen. "What happened to him after that?" Malcolm asked, his voice shaking. "They took him to jail," Leah said, her voice barely audible. "And, while he was waiting for his case to be heard, something happened. There was a fight in the prison. Your dad got caught in the middle of it. He didn't make it, Malcolm." Malcolm felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared at his mom, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. "You mean, he's gone?" Malcolm asked, his voice trembling. Leah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, baby. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. I didn't want you to grow up hating the world." Malcolm sat in stunned silence, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't hate the world, he hated Officer Daniels. Daniels had been the one who took his dad away, the one who made the mistake that cost his family everything. "I want to talk to him," Malcolm said suddenly. "Who?" Leah asked, wiping her tears. "Officer Daniels," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "I need to hear it from him. I need to know why he did it." Leah hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes. "Malcolm, I don't think that's a good idea." "I don't care," Malcolm said firmly. "I deserve answers." Leah looked at her son, seeing the determination in his eyes. She wanted to protect him, to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. But she also knew she couldn't stop him. "Be careful, Malcolm," she said finally. "Just, be careful." Officer Daniels adjusted his utility belt as he stepped out of his patrol car, his usual stoic expression firmly in place. He was used to the looks people gave him, some filled with respect, others laced with distrust. It was part of the job, something he had learned to brush off over his years of service. But today was different. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, a sense that something was brewing. Malcolm spotted him from across the street, his chest tightening. This was the man. The man who had taken his dad away. The boy's small frame stiffened with a mix of fear and determination, but he didn't waver. Clenching his fists, he stepped forward, each footfall heavy with unspoken anger. "You're the one, aren't you?" Malcolm's voice rang out, cutting through the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his head turning toward the sound. He blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion before recognition dawned. The boy. Darius's son. Malcolm didn't wait for a response. "You're the one who took my dad away," he said again, louder this time. His voice trembled, but there was steel in his gaze. The street seemed to pause. A few neighbors turned their heads, their eyes darting between Malcolm and Daniels. Even the usual background noise, kids playing, distant car horns, seemed to fade, leaving only the charged silence between the boy and the officer. Daniels stood frozen, his hand resting on his belt as if searching for something to anchor himself. He had faced down hardened criminals, survived high-stakes chases, and endured the daily pressures of law enforcement. But this was different. This was a child, staring up at him with an intensity that made his chest ache. Daniels began, but the words stuck in his throat. "Do you even know what it feels like?" Malcolm interrupted, his voice rising. "Do you even care?" Leah burst through the front door, her heart racing. She had been watching from the window, praying that Malcolm wouldn't do exactly this. But there he was, standing in the street, challenging a man she had spent years trying to avoid. "Malcolm," she called, rushing toward him. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back, but the boy didn't take his eyes off Daniels. "Why won't you answer me?" Malcolm shouted, twisting out of his mother's grip. "Why did you do it? Why did you take him?" Daniels's lips parted, but no sound came. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of Malcolm's words pressing down on him like a physical burden. For a moment, he looked older, tired in a way that went beyond the lines on his face. "I didn't have a choice," Daniels said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, unsatisfying and hollow. Leah stiffened, her grip on Malcolm tightening as she glared at the officer. "No choice?" Malcolm echoed, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You always have a choice. You could have listened to him. You could have," his words faltered, the lump in his throat making it hard to continue. Daniels took a step back, his hands briefly rising as if to defend himself, though no physical threat was present. "Kid, it's not that simple," he said, his tone strained. "You don't understand how things work." "I don't want to understand your excuses," Malcolm shouted, tears brimming in his eyes. "You ruined everything." Leah, desperate to defuse the situation, stepped between her son and the officer. "That's enough, Malcolm," she said firmly, though her voice quivered with emotion. She turned to Daniels, her expression hard. "You've said enough. Go." Daniels hesitated, his gaze flicking between Leah and Malcolm. He wanted to say something more, to explain himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded stiffly and turned away, retreating to his patrol car. As the engine roared to life and the car disappeared down the street, Malcolm slumped against his mother, the adrenaline draining from his body. Leah wrapped her arms around him, her own tears silently falling. Later that evening, Leah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Malcolm sat with his head down, tracing circles on the wood grain with his finger. "I didn't mean to make you mad, Mom," Malcolm said quietly. Leah sighed, reaching out to touch his hand. "I'm not mad at you, baby. I don't want you to get hurt." "He didn't even care," Malcolm said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "He didn't even apologize." Leah looked away, biting her lip. "Some people hide behind their badge, Malcolm. They think it protects them from having to face the consequences of their actions. But that doesn't mean we have to carry their mistakes with us." Malcolm frowned, not fully understanding but knowing his mother was trying to protect him. "I just want to know why he did it. Why he couldn't just let Dad go." Leah hesitated, her mind flashing back to that fateful night. The phone call. The sinking feeling in her chest as she rushed to the police station. The look on Daniels's face when he told her what had happened. She had replayed it all 1,000 times, searching for answers that never came. Sometimes, she said softly, people make choices out of fear. They act without thinking about the consequences. But that doesn't make it right. Malcolm nodded, though his heart still ached. He wanted more than his mother's reassurances. He wanted justice. The next day, Malcolm sat on the stoop outside their house, his knees pulled up to his chest. He couldn't shake the image of Danielle's face the way the officer had looked, almost guilty. I'm not done with him, Malcolm muttered to himself. As if on cue, his friend Jamal appeared, his skateboard tucked under one arm. Yo, you good? Jamal asked, plopping down next to him. Malcolm shrugged. Not really. Jamal studied his friend for a moment before nodding. Wanna talk about it? After a long pause, Malcolm finally told Jamal everything about his dad, about Daniels, about the confrontation in the street. Jamal listened intently, his usual playful demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. That's messed up, Jamal said when Malcolm finished. But, like, what are you gonna do? He's a cop. They always get away with stuff. Not this time, Malcolm said, his jaw tightening. I'm gonna find out what really happened. I don't care how long it takes. That night, Malcolm's resolve hardened. He didn't know how, but he was determined to get the answers he deserved. He would make Officer Daniels face the truth, even if it meant digging into the past himself. The tension between the two families was palpable now, stretching like a taut rope ready to snap. But Malcolm didn't feel fear anymore. He felt purpose. He was just a kid, but he was his father's son. And he wouldn't rest until the truth came to light. The air in the neighborhood felt heavy in the days that followed Malcolm's confrontation with Officer Daniels. Neighbors who had once greeted Leah warmly now avoided her gaze, unsure how to respond to the ripple of whispers that had spread across the block. Did you hear what Malcolm said to that cop? They say it's about Darius, maybe Leah knows more than she's letting on. Leah could feel the judgment in their stares as she walked Malcolm to the bus stop the next morning. Malcolm felt it too, but he didn't care. His mind was set on finding answers. Do you think they're mad at us, Mom? He asked as they waited by the curb. Leah sighed, brushing her fingers over his shoulder. People talk, baby. It doesn't mean they're right. But what if they don't want to help us anymore? Malcolm frowned. What if they think I'm lying? Leah crouched down, her eyes level with his. The truth doesn't change just because people don't want to believe it. Remember that, Malcolm. He nodded, but the weight of the community's silence felt as suffocating as the secrets surrounding his father. That afternoon, Malcolm decided to take matters into his own hands. His mother had told him to come straight home from school, but instead, he headed to the one place he knew might hold some answers, the precinct. The police station loomed large and cold, its glass doors reflecting the sunlight in harsh streaks. Malcolm hesitated on the steps, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing building. But then he thought of his dad, his strong, kind father who had never let fear hold him back. Summoning his courage, Malcolm pushed through the doors. The hum of phones and low chatter filled the lobby, but it all faded as his eyes locked onto Officer Daniels sitting at a desk near the corner. Hey, kid, a receptionist called out. You can't just walk in here. Who are you looking for? Malcolm ignored her and marched up to Daniels, his heart pounding in his chest. Daniels looked up, startled. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice sharp but not unkind. You owe me answers, Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. You said you didn't have a choice. What did you mean by that? Daniels glanced around, aware of the eyes now on them. This isn't the place for that, Malcolm. Go home. No, Malcolm said firmly. You don't get to just walk away this time. I want to know why you took my dad. I want to know what happened. Daniels rubbed his temples, his patience thinning. It's not that simple, kid. You don't understand how things work. Then make me understand. Malcolm shot back. The room went silent. Even the officers at nearby desks had stopped to watch the exchange. Daniel sighed heavily, standing from his chair. Fine. Let's talk outside. Out in the parking lot, the tension between them felt even more intense. Daniels leaned against the hood of his car, his arms crossed. Your dad, Darius, he got himself involved in some bad stuff, Daniels began, his voice low. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. That's not true. My dad wasn't like that. Daniels hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, people get caught up in things they can't control. Your dad made some choices that put him on the wrong side of the law. When we went to arrest him, things escalated. Malcolm's chest tightened. What do you mean escalated? Did you hurt him? Is that why he's gone? Daniels's jaw clenched. I didn't hurt him, Malcolm. But he resisted. And in situations like that, things can spiral fast. He got into a fight with another officer, and what? Malcolm demanded, tears stinging his eyes. Daniels shook his head. He was taken into custody. But he got a raw deal, okay. The system wasn't fair to him. Malcolm's voice broke. Then why didn't you help him? If you knew it wasn't fair, why didn't you do something? Daniels didn't answer right away. He looked down at his boots, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. Because I was scared, he admitted quietly. Scared of losing my job, scared of standing up to my own people. I made a mistake, Malcolm. A big one. Malcolm stepped back, his face twisted in anger and confusion. That's not good enough, he said. You're supposed to protect people. But you just let it happen. Daniels nodded, his expression grim. You're right. I failed your dad. And I've been carrying that failure ever since. Malcolm stormed off, his heart heavy with anger and grief. Daniels watched him go, his own emotions churning. He had spent years justifying his actions or lack of them, but seeing the pain on that boy's face made it impossible to keep lying to himself. Meanwhile, Leah was waiting anxiously at home. When Malcolm finally walked through the door, she rushed to him, relief quickly turning to anger. Where were you? She demanded. I've been worried sick. Malcolm dropped his backpack on the floor. I went to talk to him. To Officer Daniels. Leah froze, her face pale. What? Why would you do that? Because no one else will tell me the truth. Malcolm shouted. I needed to know what happened to Dad, and he told me. He told me everything. Leah sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. What did he say? Malcolm hesitated, his throat tightening. He said Dad fought back when they tried to arrest him. He said the system wasn't fair to him. Tears filled Leah's eyes as she shook her head. Your father didn't fight back. He was protecting himself. That's not the same thing. Then why didn't anyone help him? Malcolm asked, his voice breaking. Why did they just let it happen? Leah reached for her son, pulling him into a tight embrace. I don't know, baby. I don't know. As the days passed, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Danielle's words haunted him, but so did his mother's quiet pain. He began to dig deeper, asking questions around the neighborhood, searching for anyone who might know what really happened. Jamal joined him, loyal as ever. What's the plan, man? Jamal asked as they biked around the block one evening. We find out the truth, Malcolm said simply. But what if you don't like what you find? Jamal asked cautiously. Malcolm's jaw tightened. I have to know. For Dad. The boy stopped at the corner store, where old Mr. Harris was sitting on his usual stool. Harris had been around for decades, his memory as sharp as his wit. "You boys up to no good?" Harris joked as they approached. "Not this time," Malcolm said. "We're trying to find out about my dad. About what really happened to him." Harris's face grew serious. "Your dad was a good man," he said quietly. "But he got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's how they wanted it to look, anyway." "What do you mean?" Malcolm asked, leaning closer. Harris glanced around, lowering his voice. "There were people in the department who didn't like your dad. He was always speaking out, always standing up for what was right. That made him a target." Malcolm's heart raced. "So they set him up?" Harris nodded solemnly. "That's what I believe. And I think Officer Daniels knows more than he's letting on." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was even darker than Malcolm had imagined. Now, more determined than ever, he vowed to uncover the full truth no matter what it took. Malcolm didn't sleep much after his confrontation with Officer Daniels. His mind raced with questions, each one heavier than the last. What really happened the night his dad was taken? Why did Daniels look so guilty? The more Malcolm thought about it, the more he realized something wasn't right. His father, Darius, had flaws. Malcolm wasn't blind to that. He'd heard the whispers in the neighborhood about how Darius used to run with the wrong crowd when he was younger. But those days were long behind him. As far as Malcolm knew, his dad had been working hard, trying to provide for their family. Leah had always said, "Your dad wasn't perfect, but he loved you more than anything." So why did the police treat him like he was dangerous? Determined to uncover the truth, Malcolm started asking questions. He didn't tell his mom she'd only worry. Instead, he turned to people who might know more about what had happened. First, he went to Mr. Harris at the corner store. The old man had a reputation for knowing everything about everyone in the neighborhood. "Mr. Harris, do you remember the night they took my dad?" Malcolm asked, leaning over the counter. Harris's brows furrowed. "Boy, that was years ago. Why you digging that up now?" "Because something's not adding up," Malcolm said firmly. "I need to know what happened." Harris sighed, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Your dad, he wasn't no saint, but he wasn't what they made him out to be either. That night? It didn't sit right with me. Cops rolled up on him like he was some kind of criminal mastermind. But all he did was run a red light." Malcolm's eyes widened. "A red light? That's why they pulled him over." "That's what they said," Harris replied. "But it wasn't just any cop who stopped him. Daniels was there, and so was another Officer Collins. That one was bad news. Always had a chip on his shoulder, especially when it came to people from this neighborhood." "Officer Collins," Malcolm repeated, filing the name away. "What happened after they pulled him over?" Harris hesitated. "All I know is, there was some kind of scuffle. Next thing we hear, your dad's in cuffs, and Collins is acting like he just caught a bank robber." "Do you think they set him up?" Malcolm asked, his voice trembling. Harris leaned back, his face somber. "Wouldn't surprise me, kid. Wouldn't surprise me one bit." While Malcolm searched for answers, Officer Daniels was fighting his own demons. Every night, as he lay in bed, his mind replayed the events of that fateful evening. The flashing red and blue lights, the sound of raised voices, the chaos that unfolded in mere seconds, it all came rushing back like a storm he couldn't escape. Daniels had been partnered with Officer Collins that night. Collins had always been aggressive, quick to escalate situations. When they pulled Darius over, Collins had been the one to approach the car first. "He looks nervous," Collins had muttered to Daniels, his hand already resting on his holster. "Maybe he's just scared," Daniels had replied. "It's just a traffic stop." But Collins hadn't listened. He'd barked orders at Darius, accusing him of being evasive. When Darius tried to explain himself, things escalated. Collins yanked open the car door, shouting for Darius to get out. Daniels could still hear Darius's voice, calm but firm, "I'm not resisting. I just want to know why I'm being stopped." But Collins had shoved him against the car, and that's when everything spiraled. A shove turned into a struggle, and before Daniels could intervene, backup had arrived, and Darius was being dragged away in handcuffs. "You let it happen," Daniels whispered to himself in the dark, the guilt eating away at him. "You could have stopped it, but you didn't." The name Officer Collins stuck in Malcolm's mind like a thorn. If Collins had been there that night, maybe he held the key to understanding what really happened. But finding him wasn't easy. Collins had retired years ago, and most people in the neighborhood didn't want to talk about him. Finally, Malcolm got a tip from one of his dad's old friends, Mr. Riley. "Collins. Last I heard, he moved out to the suburbs," Riley said, lowering his voice. "But let me tell you something, Malcolm. That man? He had it out for your dad. Don't know why, but he'd been harassing Darius for months before that night." "Harassing him how?" Malcolm asked. "Pulling him over for no reason, showing up outside his job, trying to intimidate him. Your dad told me once, that man's just waiting for me to slip up." Malcolm's fists clenched. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" Riley gave him a sad smile. "Who was gonna stop a cop like Collins? People like him don't answer to nobody." Meanwhile, Daniels found himself drawn to the street where it all happened. He parked his car at the corner, watching the intersection as if it could somehow offer him clarity. He remembered how Darius had looked that night, not as a criminal, but as a father trying to get home. Daniels had stayed quiet for years, telling himself he had no choice. But now, seeing Malcolm's determination, he began to wonder if silence had been his biggest crime. One evening, Daniels stopped by Leah's house. She opened the door, her expression a mixture of surprise and distrust. "What do you want?" she asked coldly. "I need to talk to Malcolm," Daniels said. Leah crossed her arms. "Haven't you done enough?" "Please," Daniels said, his voice low. "I just want to make things right." Leah hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. When Malcolm saw Daniels in their living room, his heart raced with anger. "Why are you here?" he demanded. Daniels met his gaze, his own eyes filled with regret. "Because you deserve the truth." "All of it?" Malcolm sat down reluctantly, his arms crossed. "Then start talking." Daniels took a deep breath. "That night, it wasn't supposed to go the way it did. Collins had a personal vendetta against your dad. I don't know why, but he was out to get him. I should have stepped in, but I didn't. I was scared of Collins, scared of what would happen if I stood up to him. So you just let him ruin my dad's life?" Malcolm snapped. Daniels nodded, his face heavy with guilt. "I failed your dad. And I've been carrying that failure every day since." Malcolm's voice wavered. "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you try to stop him?" Daniels looked down at his hands. "Because I was a coward. But I don't want to be one anymore. I want to help you find the answers you're looking for." Malcolm stared at him, torn between anger and the faintest glimmer of hope. "How?" Daniels straightened. "There's evidence, dashcam footage, reports. I don't know if it's still out there, but if it is, I'll help you find it." For the first time, Malcolm saw a flicker of sincerity in Daniels's eyes. He didn't trust him completely, not yet, but he knew this might be his best chance to uncover the truth. "Fine," Malcolm said. "But if you lie to me, I'll never forgive you." "I won't," Daniels promised. As they began their search, Malcolm and Daniels found themselves unraveling a web of lies and corruption that went deeper than either of them had imagined. The truth was out there, but getting to it would test them both in ways they weren't prepared for. Malcolm didn't want to admit it, but something about Daniels's offer to help felt genuine. He wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels truly regretted what happened. Still, Malcolm wasn't about to rely on anyone else to do the hard work for him. The next morning, Malcolm met Daniels outside the police precinct. The building loomed over them, its brick walls weathered but imposing. Daniels had pulled some strings to get access to old case files, but Malcolm wasn't sure what to expect. "This is where it starts," Daniels said, holding the door open. "Then let's get it over with," Malcolm replied, stepping inside. Inside the precinct, the air felt tense. Officers moved briskly past them, barely sparing a glance. Daniels led Malcolm to a quiet office in the back, where an older woman sat behind a cluttered desk. "Betty," Daniels said, his tone softening. "I need a favor." The woman adjusted her glasses and frowned. "A favor? You've got some nerve coming in here after all these years." "I know," Daniels replied. "But it's important. It's about the Darius case." Betty's eyes narrowed. "That's old news. Why dig it up now?" "Because it was wrong," Daniels said firmly. "And I'm trying to make it right." Betty sighed, then leaned back in her chair. "You're lucky I'm retiring soon, Daniels. Otherwise, I'd tell you to leave. Follow me." She led them to the records room, a dimly lit space filled with towering shelves of file boxes. The smell of old paper hung in the air. Betty pulled out a key and unlocked a metal cabinet in the corner. "Everything from that year is in here," she said, gesturing to the files. "But don't take too long. If anyone asks, I didn't help you." Malcolm and Daniels got to work, flipping through file after file. The task was tedious, but Malcolm refused to give up. Hours passed before Daniels finally spoke. "Here it is," he said, holding up a worn folder. Malcolm grabbed it, his hands trembling. Inside were police reports, witness statements, and a transcript of Darius's court hearing. As Malcolm skimmed through the documents, one thing became clear: Officer Collins had lied. According to Collins's report, Darius had been aggressive and uncooperative during the traffic stop. But a witness statement from a bystander told a different story. "I saw the whole thing," the statement read. "The man wasn't resisting. He kept asking why he was being pulled over, but the officers didn't answer. Then one of them, Collins, grabbed him and started yelling." "This proves it," Malcolm said, his voice shaking with anger. "Collins was lying the whole time." Daniels nodded. "It's a start, but we need more. The dashcam footage would show exactly what happened." "Where is it?" Malcolm asked. Daniels frowned. "That's the problem. Footage like that doesn't just disappear, but it might have been buried. If Collins had something to hide, he'd make sure it never saw the light of day." Malcolm's heart sank. "So what do we do now?" Daniels looked him in the eye. "We keep digging. There's always a trail, you just have to know where to look." While Daniels worked on tracking down the dashcam footage, Malcolm decided to return to the neighborhood for more answers. He spoke to anyone who would listen: shopkeepers, neighbors, even kids who'd been outside the night of the arrest. One story stood out. A young woman named Tasha, who lived across the street from where the arrest happened, said she'd seen something unusual. "I remember that night clear as day," Tasha said. "There was a second car parked down the block unmarked, but definitely a cop car. Two men got out and started talking to Collins before everything went down." "Did you see what they were doing?" Malcolm asked. Tasha shook her head. "No, but it looked shady. They left right before your dad was taken away." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Tasha hesitated. Because I was scared. People who speak out against the police around here? They don't last long. Malcolm understood her fear, but her story added another piece to the puzzle. Collins hadn't been acting alone. Meanwhile, Daniels made progress of his own. Using contacts he'd built during his years on the force, he tracked down the storage facility where old dashcam footage was archived. Convincing the clerk to let him access the footage wasn't easy. Daniels had to call in a favor from an old friend, Officer Martinez, who still worked at the precinct. "You owe me," Martinez said as he handed over a USB drive. "If anyone finds out I helped you, we're both finished." "No one will know," Daniels promised. The drive contained hours of footage from the night Darius was arrested. Daniels spent the entire evening reviewing it, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The footage showed Collins pulling Darius over, just as the reports described. But what happened next was damning. Collins was aggressive from the start, yelling and making accusations. Darius stayed calm, repeatedly asking why he'd been stopped. When Collins opened the car door and grabbed Darius, it was clear Darius hadn't done anything to provoke him. The struggle that followed was entirely instigated by Collins. But the most shocking part came later in the footage. After Darius was cuffed and placed in the squad car, Collins turned to the dashcam and muttered something under his breath. "Another one off the streets," he said, smirking. Daniels knew this footage was the key to exposing the truth. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. Bringing this to light would mean going against his own department and risking his career. He called Malcolm and Leah to meet him at a neutral location, a small cafe on the edge of town. When they arrived, Daniels looked nervous but determined. "I found it," he said, sliding the USB drive across the table. "This is what you've been looking for." Malcolm stared at the drive, his emotions a whirlwind of anger and relief. "What's on it?" "Everything," Daniels replied. "Proof that Collins lied. Proof that your dad didn't deserve what happened to him." Leah's hands trembled as she picked up the drive. "Why are you doing this, Daniels?" "Why now?" "Because I can't keep running from it," he said. "I've lived with this guilt for too long. Your family deserves justice." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "And what happens to you if this gets out?" Daniels shrugged. "That's not important. What matters is making things right." With the evidence in hand, Malcolm and Leah faced a difficult decision. Exposing the truth would bring them one step closer to justice, but it would also put a target on their backs. "We can't let fear stop us," Malcolm said firmly. "Dad wouldn't want us to stay silent." Leah nodded, her voice steady. "Then we fight. For Darius, and for every family who's been through this." As they prepared to take their case public, Malcolm realized he wasn't just fighting for his father anymore. He was fighting for a better future, one where the truth couldn't be buried, and justice couldn't be ignored. The stage was set, but the battle was far from over. The thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the ground beneath Malcolm's feet as he crept closer to the shadowy figure standing by the memorial. Rain slicked the pavement, making the scene feel even heavier. He hadn't planned to follow Daniels tonight, but when he saw the officer leaving his house, something told Malcolm he needed to know where he was going. Now, standing just a few steps away, Malcolm felt a surge of emotions: curiosity, anger, and the lingering hope that tonight might finally bring answers. Daniels turned suddenly, his expression caught between surprise and resignation. His hand rested lightly on the plaque in front of him, fingers tracing the letters of Darius's name. "Why are you here?" Malcolm asked, his voice barely rising over the sound of the rain. Daniels hesitated, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world pressed down on him. "Because I owe you the truth," he said, his voice cracking under the strain. Malcolm stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Then say it," he demanded. "Say what you did. Say why you took him away from us." Daniels took a deep breath, his face etched with lines of regret. I didn't set out to hurt your father, Malcolm. But I did. And I've lived with it every day since. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. You're saying it like it just happened. Like you had no choice. Daniels shook his head. It's not that simple. That night your father was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Collins was driving the situation, and I didn't stop it. I followed orders instead of following my gut. What do you mean? Malcolm pressed, his voice rising. What orders? Daniels hesitated, glancing at the plaque as though it could shield him from the boy's accusations. There was an investigation going on. Collins claimed your dad matched the description of someone they were after, a gang leader involved in drug trafficking. But it wasn't true. It was a cover. They wanted someone to pin the case on, and your father, he became the scapegoat. Daniels's voice broke as he continued. That night at the traffic stop, Darius was calm, asking questions, trying to understand why we pulled him over. But Collins escalated it. He got aggressive, and your father pushed back, not because he was guilty, but because he was scared. Scared of what? Malcolm asked, though he already knew the answer. Daniels met his eyes, the rain dripping from his face. Scared of the system. Scared of us. He knew how these situations ended for men like him. Malcolm felt his chest tighten. And what did you do? Daniels swallowed hard. I hesitated. I wanted to stop Collins, but I didn't. I stood there while he dragged your father out of the car. I stood there while Collins used force that wasn't necessary. And when it was over, I backed him up in the report. I didn't lie outright, but I didn't tell the truth either. I let Collins bury your father in paperwork and accusations. Malcolm's breathing quickened. So you just let it happen? You stood there and let them ruin his life. Daniels nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, he admitted. And I've regretted it every day since. But it didn't end there, Malcolm. What happened after, that's what haunts me the most. Daniels reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages weathered and stained. He flipped it open and handed it to Malcolm. Inside were newspaper clippings, court documents, and letters, pieces of a puzzle Malcolm hadn't known existed. Your father fought back, Daniels said. He tried to prove his innocence, but Collins made sure the evidence against him stuck. The system doesn't care about justice, Malcolm. It cares about convictions. And Darius was an easy target. Malcolm flipped through the pages, his hands trembling. One letter, written in his father's handwriting, stood out. Leah, I'm doing my best to keep my head up in here. Tell Malcolm I love him. Tell him I'll always be proud of him, no matter what happens. Tears blurred the words as Malcolm clutched the letter to his chest. You put him there, he whispered. And he never got out. Daniels fell to his knees, the rain pooling around him. I didn't know it would end like this, he said. I thought he'd have a chance to fight it. I didn't realize how broken the system was until it was too late. Malcolm's anger boiled over. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know what it's like to grow up without a father? To watch your mom struggle every single day because of what you took from us? Daniels looked up at him, his face pale. I do, he said quietly. I see it every time I look in the mirror. And I know I can never fix it. But I want to try. I want to help you get justice for your father. Malcolm shook his head, stepping back. Justice? What does that even mean? Bringing him back? Making it all go away? You think you can just erase what you did? No, Daniels admitted. But I can expose the truth. I can take down Collins and everyone else who played a part in this. I can make sure this never happens to anyone else. As Malcolm stood there, torn between his fury and the flicker of hope in Danielle's words, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Leah. "I couldn't stay away," she said, her voice trembling. "I needed to hear it for myself." Daniels looked at her, guilt written across his face. "Leah, I'm so sorry." "Sorry won't bring him back," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "But Malcolm's right. If there's even a chance to clear Darius's name, we have to take it." Daniels nodded. "I've already started gathering evidence. The dashcam footage, the witness statements, they're all coming together. But it's risky. Collins has friends in high places, and if they find out what I'm doing, they'll bury it," Leah finished. "Just like they buried my husband." Malcolm looked between them, his anger still simmering but his resolve hardening. "Then we don't give them the chance," he said. "We take this public. We show the world what really happened." That night marked a shift in their fight for justice. Daniels handed over every piece of evidence he'd collected, promising to testify if it came to that. Leah contacted a lawyer, determined to reopen Darius's case. And Malcolm? He vowed to be the voice his father no longer had. As the storm began to subside, the three of them stood together under the dim glow of a street lamp. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. "Whatever it takes," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "We're going to make them pay." Daniels nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and regret. "And I'll be right there with you." The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Malcolm felt like they had a chance. A chance to right the wrongs, to honor his father's memory, and to bring the truth into the light. The storm's intensity lessened as they began walking back together. Leah's arms remained tightly crossed over her chest, her steps cautious beside Daniel's. Malcolm trailed behind them, his mind churning. Despite Daniel's confession and the emotional weight of the moment, Malcolm couldn't shake the gnawing resentment in his chest. "I still don't trust him," Malcolm muttered, just loud enough for Leah to hear. Leah slowed her steps, turning slightly. "You don't have to trust him," she replied. "But we need him." Daniel stopped walking, overhearing their conversation. He turned back to face Malcolm. "You don't have to trust me," he said, echoing Leah's words. "But I meant what I said. I'll do everything I can to make this right." "Making it right doesn't change what you did," Malcolm shot back, his voice sharp. "You had years to do the right thing, but you didn't. Why now? What's stopping you from bailing when it gets too hard?" Daniels hesitated, guilt clouding his expression. "Because I've already lost too much," he said softly. "My job, my reputation, they don't matter anymore. The truth is, I've spent my life trying to be the kind of officer people could trust. But that night, I failed. And I've been failing ever since. I won't fail this time." Malcolm's glare didn't waver, but Leah placed a firm hand on her son's shoulder. "We'll hold him to that," she said quietly, her voice steady. Over the next few days, the uneasy alliance began to take shape. Daniels continued digging into the case, providing Leah and Malcolm with everything he could find. Old case files, suppressed dashcam footage, and internal memos from the department began to paint a clearer picture. "This," Daniels said one evening, sliding a thick file across Leah's kitchen table, "is the smoking gun." Malcolm leaned forward eagerly, his eyes scanning the papers. It was a transcript of a conversation between Officer Collins and his superior, recorded months before Darius's arrest. "It's all here," Daniels explained. They were under pressure to solve a major drug case. Collins suggested using a fallback option, someone they could pin it on if the investigation didn't pan out. They didn't care about guilt or innocence. They just wanted someone they could parade around as the culprit. Leah's hands trembled as she picked up the document. "And Darius, he was just convenient," she whispered. Daniels nodded grimly. A family man with no priors. A guy with everything to lose. They thought he'd go quietly, take a plea deal to avoid a long sentence. But he didn't, Malcolm said, his voice brimming with pride. No, Daniels agreed. He fought back. And that's why they came down on him so hard. They wanted to make an example of him. As they pieced together the truth, the stakes grew higher. Daniels began receiving anonymous calls threatening his safety and warning him to stop digging. Leah's mailbox filled with suspicious flyers accusing her of being involved in criminal activities, an obvious attempt to intimidate her. One evening, as they worked late into the night, Malcolm noticed a car parked down the street. Its headlights were off, but he could see the faint glow of someone inside. "Mom," he whispered, nudging Leah. Leah looked up, her face pale. "Daniels," she called out, motioning toward the window. Daniels peered through the blinds, his expression darkening. "They're watching us," he said quietly. "Who?" Malcolm demanded. "Collins's people," Daniels replied. "They know we're onto them." Fear rippled through the room, but Leah squared her shoulders. "Let them watch," she said firmly. "We're not backing down." The next morning, Leah reached out to an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. It was a risky move, but they needed someone with influence to help bring the story to light. The journalist, a woman named Rachel Navarro, arrived at their home with a small camera crew. She listened intently as Daniels recounted the events leading to Darius's arrest. Malcolm and Leah provided their own testimony, painting a picture of the life that had been stolen from them. "This is big," Rachel said, her voice filled with determination. "If we can verify these documents, this could blow the lid off the entire department." Daniels handed her the stack of files. "Verify them. Double-check everything. We need this to be airtight." As the crew packed up, Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Leah's arm. "You're incredibly brave," she said. "This isn't just about your husband anymore. This could change everything for families like yours." Leah nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's what Darius would have wanted," she said. The story broke a week later, sending shockwaves through the community. Headlines read, "Wrongfully accused, a family's fight against corruption and former officer exposes systemic injustice." The backlash was immediate. The police department released a statement denying the allegations, but public outcry forced them to announce an internal review. Protests erupted outside the station, demanding accountability. For Malcolm, it was a bittersweet victory. As he watched the news coverage, he felt a glimmer of pride. But the ache of his father's absence remained. "We're doing this for him," Leah reminded him one evening, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know," Malcolm replied. "I just wish he were here to see it." The pressure mounted as the investigation gained traction. Daniels knew it was only a matter of time before Collins made his move. Sure enough, one night, as Daniels left a late meeting with Leah and Malcolm, Collins cornered him in a dark alley. "You've really lost it, haven't you?" Collins sneered, stepping out of the shadows. "Throwing your career away for some dead convict?" Daniels didn't flinch. "That convict was an innocent man. And you destroyed his life." Collins laughed bitterly. "You think anyone cares? People want results, Daniels. They don't care how we get them." "Well, they'll care now," Daniels shot back. "The truth is out. And it's going to take you down." Collins's face darkened, his bravado slipping. "You've made a lot of enemies, Daniels. Don't think they won't come for you." "Let them," Daniels said, stepping closer. "I've got nothing left to lose." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal battles and media coverage. Rachel's investigation uncovered even more damning evidence, implicating not just Collins but several high-ranking officials. Leah and Malcolm attended every hearing, their presence a constant reminder of the human cost of corruption. Each time, Malcolm felt a surge of pride seeing his mother's unwavering strength. When Daniels took the stand, he spoke with raw honesty. He recounted the events of that night, exposing the lies that had buried Darius's truth. "I failed him," Daniels said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I won't fail his family." In the end, the court ruled in Leah's favor, clearing Darius's name and awarding the family a settlement. Collins and his accomplices were indicted, facing charges ranging from evidence tampering to wrongful imprisonment. As the verdict was read, Malcolm felt a rush of relief. It wasn't enough to bring his father back, but it was a start. Leah hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. "No, Mom," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "Dad did it. We just made sure everyone else knew." The weeks that followed the revelation felt like a whirlwind of emotions and events. The city, the community, and even the nation were shaken by the truth. The news was everywhere: former officer blows whistle on wrongful arrest, family fights for justice. It was the headline that changed everything. At first, the response from the public was mixed. Many people, especially those who had seen Daniels as a hero, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the man who had admitted to making a tragic mistake. But for Leah, the truth was both a relief and a burden. Her anger had slowly transformed into something more complex, a blend of sorrow, vindication, and finally peace. The justice they had fought for had come, but it came too late for Darius. Malcolm, on the other hand, felt something different. The anger had dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet determination. His father's name had been cleared, but the pain of his absence would never go away. There was a bitter sweetness in that victory. It was the kind of victory that felt both like a fresh start and a long, painful reminder of everything they had lost. The first sign that change was coming was the reopening of Darius's case. The court system was forced to confront the truth. Darius had been wronged, and the authorities could no longer pretend otherwise. The hearings began, with witnesses called to testify about the events of that fateful night. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the truth came to light. The judge, an elderly man with a reputation for fairness, looked both disheartened and resolute. "There will be no more hiding this," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "This community deserves better, and this family deserves justice." Leah sat in the front row, her face pale but proud. She had fought for this moment for years, and now that it was finally here, she could barely allow herself to believe it was real. Still, she held on, determined to see it through. Malcolm, standing beside her, watched as the pieces of the case fell into place. It was like a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for years. The questions he'd asked, the things he'd never understood, were finally being answered. But it wasn't the answers he had imagined that made him feel whole, it was the truth itself, no matter how painful. In the end, Darius's record was cleared. It wasn't just an apology or a retraction, it was a full exoneration. The officer who had been responsible for his wrongful arrest was tried and convicted, and the corrupt practices that had allowed such things to happen were exposed for the world to see. The community was divided at first, with some siding with the officers, others with the family, but in time, the weight of the truth started to shift people's perceptions. The system had failed Darius, and many began to recognize that it wasn't just a personal failure, it was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. The most unexpected part of the resolution came when the city announced it would establish a scholarship fund in Darius's name. It was a tribute to the man who had been wronged by the very system he had worked to support. The scholarship would provide funds for young people in the community to pursue higher education, just as Darius had always dreamed for his son, Malcolm. The announcement was made during a community event, a small ceremony that felt both monumental and humbling. Leah stood on the stage, her hands shaking as she accepted the first donation to the fund. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A sign that her husband's life, his sacrifices, would mean something beyond the courtroom. Malcolm was sitting in the front row, his eyes fixed on his mother. It was hard for him to fully absorb everything. His father's name was now associated with something larger than their family's pain. It was a legacy of hope, of redemption, and a future that had once seemed impossible now lay before him. Malcolm had always known he wanted to be something more than the boy who lost his father. But now, with the scholarship in place, he had the opportunity to make that dream a reality. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to imagine what life could be like if he followed his passion for education, if he could build something that would honor his father's name. For Daniels, the journey didn't end with the public apology. It didn't end with the confessions he made to Malcolm and Leah, or even with the justice that was finally served. The man he had been who had upheld the law blindly could no longer exist in the same form. He had seen the truth, and it had shaken him to his core. His career was in ruins, his reputation in tatters, but in a strange way, Daniels felt free for the first time in years. Daniels had lost everything, but he had gained something too, a sense of purpose. The days of hiding behind his badge and pretending to be part of a system that was above reproach were over. He had made the mistake of thinking he was serving justice when all he was doing was perpetuating the same old injustices. With that understanding, Daniels made a commitment to himself. He was going to work toward fixing the system, not from the outside, but from within. He began attending meetings with activists and reformers, engaging in conversations he had once avoided. It was a humbling experience, but he was determined to make a difference. At first, Leah didn't know how to feel about Daniels's decision to stay in law enforcement. He had done so much wrong, after all. But over time, she began to see that his repentance wasn't just about words, it was about actions. He had taken responsibility, and now, he was doing everything in his power to ensure that what happened to Darius would never happen again. As the months passed, Daniels and Malcolm developed a relationship, one that neither of them had expected. In the beginning, it was awkward. Malcolm still harbored a lot of anger, and Daniels didn't know how to bridge the gap. But slowly, through their shared goal of justice, an unlikely friendship formed. Daniels became something of a mentor to Malcolm, guiding him through the tough decisions he faced about his future. Daniels's experience in the system provided a different perspective on what it meant to challenge authority, to fight for justice even when the system itself was broken. "I know you're not ready to forgive me yet," Daniels said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "And that's okay. I just want you to know that I'm here for you, in whatever way you need me." Malcolm looked at him, his expression softened by time and understanding. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for what happened," he said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I can't respect you now. You're doing what's right. And that matters." Daniels smiled, a small but genuine smile. "That's all I can ask for." The story of Darius's wrongful conviction was one of pain, anger, and ultimately, redemption. But it was also a story of hope. Through the pain, through the suffering, something beautiful had been born, a chance for change, a chance for the community to heal, and a chance for Malcolm to grow beyond his father's legacy. Leah, standing beside her son, knew that the fight was far from over. The world wasn't fixed, not by a long shot. But at least now, they had a path forward. A path that would lead to a future where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. A path where the wrongs of the past could be acknowledged, and where those who had been silenced could finally speak. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But as they stood together, as a family and an unlikely ally, they knew that the work of justice had only just begun. And in the end, that was enough. Malcolm stood in front of the memorial, his hands resting on the cool stone. The air was still, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, but there was something else in the air too, something different. It wasn't just sorrow. It was a quiet strength, the kind that had slowly built up over the months. It was the kind of strength that comes from facing the truth, no matter how painful, and still standing tall. The memorial in front of him was a simple one. His father's name was etched in the stone, a name that had once been tied to a tragedy. But now, it was a name that stood for something more. Darius's life and the fight for justice had sparked a movement that no one could ignore. And though Darius was gone, his impact would live on through Malcolm and the work they were doing together. Malcolm's mind drifted back to the early days, to the moments when his father had been taken away. Those days had been filled with confusion and anger, with questions that seemed to have no answers. But now, after everything that had happened, after the trials and the pain, Malcolm understood one important thing: justice wasn't something that could be given to you. It was something you had to fight for, even when the odds were stacked against you. My dad always told me to never stop fighting for what's right, Malcolm said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Now, I know what he meant. Sometimes, even the people who make mistakes can help fix them. He spoke the words clearly, without hesitation. They were words that carried weight, words that meant something deep to him now. They were the kind of words that came from experience, from facing his own fears, and from watching the world around him slowly begin to change. As he stood there, with the wind gently brushing his face, he felt the weight of the years of hurt and pain start to lift. It wasn't gone completely, not yet, but he could see the horizon. The future was now open to him in a way that it hadn't been before. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood. It was as if the world itself was giving him a sign, telling him that everything would be okay, that his journey wasn't just about finding answers, but about creating change. He wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing for sure: his father's fight for justice had passed on to him, and now it was his turn to carry it forward. Malcolm turned to look out across the neighborhood, the place that had once seemed so small to him. It wasn't just a collection of houses and streets anymore. It was a community. It was a place where people's lives intertwined, where the struggles of one person affected everyone else. It was a place where change was possible, no matter how big or small. He thought about everything he had learned, the truth about his father, the power of standing up for what's right, and the importance of forgiveness. He thought about Daniels, a man who had once been his enemy but who had now become an ally. He thought about his mother, Leah, who had taught him the meaning of resilience. Through all the pain and the uncertainty, Leah had never stopped believing that there was a way to make things right. And now, they had done it. They had cleared Darius's name, and together, they had taken a stand against the injustices that had torn their family apart. And yet, despite all that had happened, Malcolm knew this wasn't the end. He had learned that justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. It was something you had to keep striving for, something you had to keep fighting for, no matter what. There was a quiet determination in Malcolm's heart as he stood there at the memorial, gazing out over the neighborhood. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly what his future held. But he knew this: his father's story wasn't just about pain and loss. It was about redemption, about giving people a second chance, about finding the strength to do what was right even when it seemed impossible. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of orange and pink behind it, Malcolm felt a deep sense of peace. He was ready for whatever came next. He had been through the storm, and he had come out stronger on the other side. Now, it was his time to make a difference. To be the change he wanted to see in the world. This is only the beginning, Malcolm thought to himself. I have so much more to do. So much more to fight for. The sun's golden light bathed everything in a soft, warm glow, and for the first time, Malcolm felt like he could finally breathe. He was ready to take on the world, not just as the boy who had lost his father, but as the young man who was going to make sure no one else had to suffer the same way. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight, but Malcolm had learned something important. He had learned that the fight for justice wasn't a single moment in time. It was a lifetime of small victories and difficult choices. It was about standing up, even when it seemed like the world was against you, and knowing that every step forward mattered. As the last rays of the sun faded into the evening sky, Malcolm took a deep breath. He felt the weight of the past on his shoulders, but he also felt the strength to carry it. With each passing day, he would continue to fight for what was right. For his father. For the people he loved. And for everyone who had been wronged. The world may not have been perfect, but in that moment, Malcolm knew one thing for sure: he was going to change it. And that was just the beginning.